Okay, for the main deal of today, we've got John Hall. Would you like to come forward, John? John, I will say, is an expert on Rolls-Royce. I've been around to his house a number of times. He's got probably every book that's ever been written on Rolls-Royce. He is an aviator, or has been an aviator. He's taken an interest in devices with Rolls-Royce engines in them. So without further ado, we'll hand it over to John, and you can tell us all about Rolls-Royce up to Schneider Trophy in 1930s, the early 1930s, and I've got designs on getting John back for the next version or the next update on Rolls-Royce, and after we finish this one. Over to you, John.
Yeah, well there we have the very first old Fliers group.
Oh yeah.
109 years before us. That bloke there, I reckon, is either Oswald or Horace Short. That guy, I'm fairly certain, is Eustace Short, the Short brothers. That there, that's Louis Blériot, and that is Samuel F. Cody, an early pioneer aviator. You've probably all heard of him. And that guy up there, Charles Stewart Rolls. So that was the first meeting of old pilots. We know who that is, Henry Royce. Most of you know him. You know him, W.Mitchell. Fairly significant man in aviation, but he's W.I. Bentley of the Bentley Motor Car Company, and he had a lot to do with aeroplanes, believe it or not. Now, back in those days, all these three blokes had one thing in common. They were all, first careers were all in the locomotive industry. They all built locomotives. Reggie Mitchell, he had no training whatsoever in aeronautics. He was self-taught, mainly because back in those days there probably wasn't any. What used to happen when you were a premier apprentice with one of those railway companies, your family had to pay them for the privilege of teaching you. You didn't get a wage. They paid, and they taught you. Now that was fine for Bentley because his family were very, very wealthy, very, very privileged. Reg Mitchell's family weren't far badly off either. His dad was a schoolmaster, or headmaster, and he also owned a printing company, so they could afford the fees. And it wasn't only the fees, you had to be boarded out and looked after at the same time. Now Henry Royce, he came from a very impoverished background. His father died when he was 8, he was bankrupt. He had a couple of brothers and sisters, and it was all his mother could do to keep a roof over their head and keep them fed. But he was lucky he had an auntie who agreed to pay his fees for the 5 years. But unfortunately, after 3 years, she ran out of money, and he had to go. So these two guys finished their apprenticeships. They got their certificates. Royce didn't. But he was lucky. He was boarded out with a man called Yarrow, Mr. and Mrs. Yarrow. And Yarrow, at the back of his house, had a very well-equipped machine shop, lathes, shapers, and drill presses, the whole bit. And he probably taught Royce more than anybody the trade of engineering. But anyway, he lost his job. He tramped northwards, got a job at a machine shop somewhere for 11 shillings a week, saved a bit of money, he decided he'd like to get involved in electricity. So he went to night school, learned all about electricity, or as much as he could, and there was a job going, all the towns were starting to be electrified back then, and he got a job with one of the electric companies on the basis of what he knew. And at the age of 21, he was in charge of a whole town. It was his job to look after all the electricity in the town. But unfortunately, the company expanded far too fast and went bust, so he was out of work again. So he'd saved up £20, had a mate there, Ernest Claremont, who worked with him. He had £50, and between the two of them, they started up F.H. Royce and Company, or making electric switches, and one of the things they made was the bayonet fittings on our light globes. We still use them to this day. Made thousands and thousands of them. But he had a line of bells, little electric bells. That was a fashionable thing to do, and the business prospered. And he went into cranes. He started making electric cranes. And he was such a paranoid about perfection that these cranes were you just couldn't get anything better. And some of them were working well into the 1950s. They were still going. So his business prospered. And they both did all right. But he decided he'd like to have a motor car. So he bought a second-hand Tacoma, which, a lot of people reckon, he reckoned it was no good. Well, by the standards of the day, that wasn't a bad car. They were all pretty rough. They belched smoke, threw oil everywhere and made a lot of noise. But he reckoned he could make a better one, which he did. He built 3 of them. So he announced he would build 3 cars of his own design, which he did. The first car was ready in April 1904. It only took him about 6 months to do it. And he sold one of the cars to a guy over the road who was a guy named Henry Inwards, who had a outfit called W.T. Glover and Company who made electric cables. He was quite a wealthy man. And he was also a keen motorist. And he knew Charles Rolls down in London. So he was so impressed with this car that he took it down and showed Rolls. And Rolls was one of these guys that he had a father that was fabulously rich. He was son of Lord Lagentop of Bournemouth. So money was no object to him, but he wasn't a Bertie Wooster type that wasted his time. He went and got a degree in mechanical engineering at Cambridge, and he started up a business selling high-end motor cars to the nobility. But he was upset because he couldn't get an English car that was good enough to sell. They were all French or German or wherever. So Edmonds decided that it'd be a good idea if he had a look at this thing of Rolls's. He took it down and showed it to him, and he tried to get Rolls to go down to London to meet him. Rolls wouldn't go, so Muhammad wouldn't go to the mountain, so you bring the mountain to Muhammad. Charles Rolls was persuaded to go up and meet Royce in Manchester. The 2 blokes hit it off straight away. They came from 2 diverse backgrounds. Royce came from the wrong side of the tracks. Rolls came from privilege, and Royce was 15 years older than him. But they got off straight away, hit it off. So they decided that he was so impressed with his car, he decided, right, you're the man I want. You can make the motor cars. I'll sell them down in London. So they formed the great company Rolls-Royce. That's Henry Edmonds, and he's always known as the godfather of Rolls-Royce. He disappeared after that. Well, he didn't disappear, but he was out of the business. But he brought them both together, and that's what formed the company. Now, Rolls was a balloonist. He was an adventurer of all sorts. When they made their cars, he raced them. That was a good way to sell them. So there he is in a Rolls-Royce having a bit of a race in 1907. Now, he devoted all his time, of course, to aviation and the motor industry, and the company went from strength to strength. Now, the brains behind the whole thing was this guy, Claude Goodman Johnson, who's known as the hyphen. If you notice there's always a hyphen between Rolls and Royce. And he was the businessman. It was all very well for Royce to be making motor cars and Rolls to be flying around in his aeroplanes, but this was a public company, and half the shares were allotted to the public, and he had to keep the place going. And he was a promoter, a smart businessman, and a damn good sales. Place went like a rocket. They employed this guy, Ernest Hyves. In the second half we'll come to him, but he's a very significant man, this bloke. But there he is there, in that car. He lapped Brooklands at 100 miles an hour. Not with me in it, he wouldn't. But that's what he did. Now, Charlie Rolls went to France and met the Wright brothers. And in fact, flew with Wilbur Wright and bought a Wright Flyer. Now there he is there, getting ready to do the English Channel from Dover to France. And he's waiting there for the weather to change. But what he did, that Blériot had only gone a month before, but he went over and back. In other words, he did the first double crossing, and he became a national hero. There he is there coming back. That's an old photo. Now here, there was a big exhibition in Bournemouth of flying, and he was taking part in it. And there he is sitting in his plane ready to take off. The competition was, there was going to be a spot landing competition, and there was a big circle and he had to land inside, and that's what he did, but like that. Because the plane broke up. He was coming in too low, he pulled the stick back, plane broke up, and he got killed. That was the end of Charles Rolls. The first bloke to get to the aeroplane was Cuthbert Moore Brabazon, later to become Lord Brabazon of Tara. You've all heard of him, I suppose. He's only 32 years of age. Now that was in 1910. Now Henry Royce, at the same time, he got stomach cancer. So, and he became a semi-invalid. So the whole operation, without Claude Johnson, the whole thing could have fallen apart. He held it together somehow. Now what he did was said to Royce, right, you can't go anywhere near the factory ever again because you work too hard. He used to abuse himself. Worked 23 hours a day, 7 days a week, wouldn't eat, and of course that's what happened to him, he got stomach. So World War I came along. The Ministry of Defence decreed that you can't make any more motor cars anymore. You're going to make aeroplane engines. Royce didn't want to know about it, but he was told. And he had to make 50 of those Renault air-cooled V8s. Now he didn't like V8s, and he didn't like air-cooled engines, and he certainly didn't like that one, but he did his 50. He decided, oh, this is no good, my name's on that and I don't like it, I'm going to make my own engine. That was his World War I engine, the Rolls-Royce Eagle. Have a good look at it, it's a beauty. If you look at the way it's a water-cooled engine, see how the water jacket's around each cylinder? And the dirty grey hub there where you can attach the propeller, and it looks like it was a wet sump, but I don't know. But anyway, they made thousands of those and they were very, very successful in World War I. There's one on test, see, try to turn it over. Big job. Now, while all that was happening, we get to Walter Owen Bentley. He was a rich man and he did what all rich men do. They raced motor cars, raced motorbikes because they didn't have much. But he started a company selling DFP, Dorio, Flandrin and Parent. That was the name of the car, but it was called a DFP. And he had the franchise to sell those, and he sold them quite successfully by racing them. You know, that's racing improves the breed, apparently. Now, one day he was over in France at Mr. Dorio's office, and he picked up a little memento on his desk, and it was a piston, but it was cast in aluminium. And the lights went on. He thought, hang on, I can put aluminium pistons in a car. Never been done before. So he said to Dorio, I want you to make me a set of pistons. He said, oh, you're mad, you're mad. And he said, no, I want it done. And being a railway engineer, he knew how to mix metallurgy. Aluminium in itself would have been far too soft, but he worked out that you put 12% copper in it, and it made it nice and hard, and you got a very, very light piston instead of a steel one or an iron one. And he got Dorio to make. Didn't tell anybody, kept it a big secret. Won all the class events at Brooklands. Nobody knew why. This little car, going like a dream. World War I. He decided, well, what am I going to do? And he went to see a Commander Briggs of the Royal Naval Air Service. Now, the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps were two separate organisations. They were rivals. And he got a job. Well, Briggs said to him, right, well, what are you going to do with this aluminium piston? We've got to get it out there. So he took it to Rolls-Royce, hives of Rolls-Royce, tested it and said, yeah, fine. A couple of the other manufacturers reckoned it was great. But his job then became to find out why so many Royal Naval Air Service pilots were being lost because of engine failure. They were losing far too many. They weren't getting shot down. They were crashing because their engines seized up. So he had to go to France and find out what was wrong. And they were all running these little Clerget rotary engines. Now, for those of you that may not know, a rotary is an engine that revolves around a fixed crankshaft. Think of an idea, I reckon. But anyway, I don't know how you fly one with a gyroscopic effect of a dirty great rotary in front of you and a propeller, but they did. He worked out as it was spinning around, it was only being fueled on one side. And they had a little thing called an obturator ring in the top of the cylinder, which when the thing distorted, was supposed to keep the compression up. But what happened, they'd break and the engines would seize. In the end he said, look, I'll design my own engine. And there he is. They made him a lieutenant because he had to have some rank so he could tell people what to do. Apparently, the way he tells it anyway, he went to Briggs. Briggs said, right, you're now Lieutenant Bentley. Here's a purchase order. Go and get yourself a uniform and get over to France. I think he must have had a bit more of formality than that, but that's what he reckons in his autobiography. And he designed 2 rotary engines, the Bentley RB1 and the Bentley RB2, which were highly successful engines. And in his autobiography, he reckons the British government ordered 30,000 of those. It's an awful lot. I didn't think they had 30,000 planes, but anyway, that's what he reckons. And they were highly successful. There's a row of Royal Naval Air Service Camels fitted with the Bentley Rotary. I reckon they must have been damn hard to fly with that bloody engine spinning around in front of them. Look, if you have a look there, they've got a very tiny little rudder, you know, and they've got all this gyroscopic effect of the motor and the propeller, and this tiny rudder to try and control it. So they must have been a tricky operator. So after World War I, Eagle engine that he made, they put them in Vickers-Vimy bombers, which never saw service in World War I anyway, but Alcock and Brown flew one from America to England, across the Atlantic, landed in the bog, through no fault of the motor. Notice, that particular aeroplane is now hanging up in the Science Museum in London. They fixed it up and they've sectioned it so you can go in and have a look at it hanging from the roof. At the same time, Ross and Keith Smith, they flew a Vimy with those 2 engines from England to Australia. No problem with the motors, they're as reliable as all hell. There they are, there's Ross Smith in the centre there. And that guy there is Hudson Fish. He was up there sorting out the aerodromes for commercial aviation. Now that's the story of those. Now then we come, after the war, we come to the Schneider. Now, of course, Reginald Mitchell, in 1916, he was only fairly young, he got a job as personal assistant to Sir Hubert Scott Payne of Supermarine. And it didn't take him very long to rise through the ranks and become chief designer of Supermarine. Now, he's more famous for designing seaplanes than he is for the Spitfire, because he designed 28 types, culminating, of course, in the Spitfire. There's the Schneider Trophy. Awful looking thing, I reckon. But it took, nations took it very seriously. America, England, France, Germany. It was prestiged to win this thing. The Americans, no less than Jimmy Doolittle in 1925, he won it from America. They gave it away. They didn't bother after that. But the rules were that if one country won it for 3 times, 3 times in succession, the trophy became theirs permanently. Now, by 1931, Britain had won it twice, and the race was going to be held between Italy and England. And the government of Ramsay MacDonald said, well, we're not going to finance it, so you can't have the race, because there was an outcry. Now, this lady here, Lady Lucy Houston, a real patriot of England, she said, well, you know, if you're too lousy to put the money up, I will. And she kicked in $100,000. But it's worth having a study of her. She was born Lucy Radnell. Father was a boxmaker, Cockney background, and she was a part-time actress. And of course, she came to the attention of Mr. Fred Gretton, who owned a brewery. Multi-millionaire he was. She was only 16, so he left his wife. She took her over to France, and there she was always known as Mrs. Gretton. They'll never marry. But anyway, he was quite a lot older than her, and when he died, he left her £6,000 a year for life. Now, £6,000 back then was an awful lot of money. She then married a Theodore Francis Brinkman in 1883. He died in 1895, but they divorced. And the word is that he left her £50,000, but no evidence of that, but anyway, they said so. Now, the third time she got married, she married the 9th Lord Byron. Now, he was bankrupt in 1899, he didn't have a razoo, but he had a title. She was entitled to call herself Baroness. But he died. He lasted for 16 years. He lasted for 16 years. Lived on her money. But anyway, he died. And she was out on her ear again. Because of all that, she moved in all the high circles, royal family, the whole bit, you know, she knew everybody. And in 1924, she hit the jackpot. She really hit the jackpot this time. She married Sir Robert Houston, a shipping baron, a ruthless shipping baron he was. Owned the Houston shipping line. Some say he died from too much whiskey, too many cigars, and probably too much of something. But he left her £6 million. She hit the jackpot, believe me. And in addition to the £6 million, she got his yacht. His steam yacht, 1,600-ton steam yacht. Now that's a ship. That's not a yacht, that's a ship. And she kept it right all through her life and used it a hell of a lot. So that's Lady Lucy Houst. Believe it or not, she changed the history of the world. Because without her £100,000, there'd have been no 1931 Schneider Trophy race. There'd have been no Merlin engine, because it followed on from that. And there'd have been no Spitfire. And they all reckon there should be statues of her up in Trafalgar Square. But there should be. She earned it. That's a picture of her in later life. And that's a picture of her on the back of a yacht there with the Schneider Trophy pilots. And up there's Reginald Mitchell. He doesn't look very happy, but that's him anyway. So to win the Schneider, that's a grave. After that, she even financed the first flight over Everest, and another £100,000 she put out. But she was quite a benefactor if she could afford to be. But, now, this here says, and I'll read it, I'll quote. Without Lady Houston, Mitchell's design team would not have gained the experience in producing high-speed aircraft that led to the development of the Spitfire fighter, or at least not in time to join the Hurricane in fighting off the Luftwaffe in 1940. And that is according to Air Chief Marshal Sir Michael Graydon, President of the Battle of Britain Memorial Trust. That's what he said. Now, Sir Arthur Sitgreaves, who's that guy there, he was the boss of Rolls-Royce at the time, and he says that the Schneider Trophy advanced engine technology by 10 years. It wouldn't have been a Merlin without that race. Now, flying those things, it was a really dangerous occupation. These guys were the astronauts of their time. 13 of them got killed, none during the race, but they were all killed during testing of the plane, testing and practicing. But there were 13 of them killed. That guy Sam Kincaid there, he was a British pilot. Now, he was no fool. He had 32 victories in World War I and 10 in Russia. So he had 42 victories to his credit. Still didn't keep him alive, because he pulled a stunt where he thought, well, I'll come in from a high height and I'll dive over the start line, plenty of speed. The only trouble is he didn't pull out. Got killed. All these other guys. And if you look at that, in 1931 is where four of them died. That's when the aeroplanes got really sophisticated. That's one of Mitchell's first, what we'd call float planes. And if you look at it, it's extremely clean. No struts, no nothing. It had a Napier Lion engine in it, which was a W12. So there's one bank of cylinders. There's another bank on the top, and on the other side was the other bank. But by then, that aircraft, or that engine had reached the end of its development. They couldn't get any more horsepower out of it. The Ministry of Defence and other people decided they'd approach Rolls-Royce. Can you get us an engine that will power this Schneider Trophy racer? It became known as the R engine. That engine, believe it or not, in its final iteration, developed 2,700 horsepower. Very impractical because it only lasted an hour and blew up after an hour. But that's all it had to do. Yeah, what an hour, that's right. To make it, they didn't have time to design a new engine, and that's an offshoot of an engine called the Buzzard, which is the biggest engine that Rolls-Royce made at the time. Took a hell of a lot of development. When they first started, it was burning 112 gallons of oil an hour. 112 gallons of oil an hour. And guess what it was? It was castor oil. So when they operated the engine inside the factory, the stuff was running down the walls, and nobody suffered from constipation. They finally got it down to about 11 by changing the rings and doing all sorts of things. One of the other big problems was that the exhaust valves would glow red, and of course it would blow the motor up because it's such a high. They were running it at plus 55 pounds boost back in 1931, and that was unheard of back then. Absolutely unbelievable. And they made these. They were running these marine type conrods. They're extremely expensive to manufacture. You notice how there's two bearing shells and two shells, and then the rod bolts onto the top of them. Extremely complicated to make. So then they just went to an ordinary conrod, made the bearing area a bit bigger, and made a big difference. Now there's a guy called Rodwell Banks, later to become Sir Rodwell Banks Air Marshal Sir Rodwell Banks. And he got these sodium-cooled valves. In other words, they were hollow and they're full of sodium, and they would take the heat away from the valve, so it didn't glow red hot. And he also mixed up. He was a bit of a fuel expert, and he mixed up all this concoction of fuel, methanol and acetone and toluol, and all the stuff that was highly toxic. Plenty of tetraethyl lead, and you had to be in a spacesuit just about to handle this stuff because it was highly dangerous. But that's how they got the motor to run and do the job. Now, there they are changing an engine. Now up there somewhere is aircraftman T.E. Shaw. Anyone like to guess who T.E. Shaw was? Got it in one. That's the real one too. That's not Peter O2. There's the aeroplane. Now we've covered the engine, but to design this aeroplane, it was a real. Mitchell called it a flying bloody radiator, because it had to disperse 44,000 BTUs of heat a minute out of that engine. The way they did it, those strakes along the side, they're actually the oil radiator. The oil was kept in the fin, and it went up and down, up that side and down the other, and that cooled the oil. Coolant went through the wings. The wings were double skinned, and the whole surface of the wing was a radiator. It'd go in between the top and bottom skin, top and bottom it was, so it had a whole skin, and they had air intakes that let the air get in through the airfoil, and that got rid of most of the heat. The whole wing was open. And they also had radiators in the top of the fin, top of these floats. If you have a look at this one. That's an S6. Look at the length of the floats, and notice that they've got no water rudder. So the only way you could steer this thing in the water was with your tail. Made it very difficult to control. Have a look here. Now, that to me looks like a trim tab stuck on the back to keep the thing straight. That's George Stainforth up there when he broke the world airspeed record. But to fly these things, it was hell. It was absolutely hell. There's the course they had to go around. They were running at 350 miles an hour. Those turns there and there were 3.5 to 4 Gs. And there were no G suits in those days. If you had to do 7 laps of that course, which is what it was, that means you blacked out 14 times, and you're only 200 feet above the water. Not much fun. To start with, they couldn't get them off they couldn't get the things off the water. There's a typical takeoff. Now, if you look at, see that 7 there? That's that plane there. And that's how you had to get it off. Now, they wrote a report on how you got the thing off the water, because there was the pitch of the propeller was fixed. There was no variable pitch propeller or constant speed propeller there. It was one pitch, and it was extremely coarse. And the other thing they had to do, when it was doing this high-speed turns, the fuel pumps couldn't get the fuel out of the floats because of the high G. So they had to put a pressure tank up there somewhere that held enough fuel to get around the corner so that the thing got level, and then the pump would work again. So you're dicing with death. But to get it off the water, they decided that you take off 70 degrees to the right of the wind feed, because the propeller was so stalled, and add a little bit of lift at the tip of the prop. They could get it going, and as they full right aileron, full right rudder, and it would slowly swing back, so that at the point of takeoff it was into wind. And you had to do that while you were blind, because you couldn't see. So I reckon the only way they could have done it, must have had a directional gyro or something in there, because they all said that they couldn't see out of it. And when you look at it, where their head was, you look there, that's where his head was there. Now, you can't see over there at all. Got no vision whatsoever. That's how they did it. And then, of course, when they got the thing off the water, they had to land it. And that wasn't easy either, because it came in about 100 mile an hour, 95 to 100 mile an hour, no flaps, no air brakes, and no water rudder to steer it. You know, if you came in, and they never shut the shipping lanes off. I mean, they were just there, and everybody else just carried on. If some clown drove a boat in front of you, and you wanted to go around again, and you rammed the throttle over, the torque of the motor just would have flicked you over. You'd have been dead. So, and as they said, they couldn't see. They sort of come in, and as the nose had raised, they'd be trying to work out where the bottom was. And anyway, they got them down. They were the astronauts of their day, believe me. Now, those two planes, well, that plane there is now in the Science Museum. There's the Schneider Trophy. England's got it forever. Now, they didn't waste the engines. Captain George Easton got hold of two of them, put them in his land speed record car, the Thunderbolt. So they are there, one side by side. And these engines were so powerful that the aerodynamic drag of the car exceeded the traction of the wheels. The wheels were constantly slipping. They couldn't overcome the aerodynamic drag of the car. So he decided he'd make a four-wheel drive one, but it still had the same problem. Back here, there are air brakes that used to flick out. When he tried to stop, Malcolm Campbell put one in his Bluebird. He did it conventionally. He put an engine up the front, threw a drive shaft like an ordinary car. But he had the same trouble. He couldn't get traction in the back wheels to overcome the torque of the motor. They were so great. There it is there being built. And look at the size of it. You know, there's a bloke up in the engine there, look. Up in the front of it. It's a huge thing. And unfortunately, it got burnt in New Zealand in a fire, so it doesn't exist anymore. Now, another guy, Dehane Seagrave, he put two of them in his speedboat, Miss England. They drove through a step-up gearbox up the front there, back through the shaft, and turned that prop at 12,000 RPM. He won. He did his 2 laps on Lake Coniston. Got the world's water speed record.